The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara Whitmore would later think was the most ordinary day for an extraordinary thing to happen. She was sitting in the back office of the Harwick University Library in Boston, cataloging a collection of 19th century agricultural journals that nobody had touched in 40 years, when the university mail clerk slid an envelope across her desk without a word. The return address was a law firm in Sheridan, Wyoming. The name on the envelope was hers. Clara set down her pen. She looked at the envelope for a long moment, the way she looked at rare manuscripts carefully, with the understanding that whatever was inside had weight, had consequence, had the power to rearrange things. She was 22 years old. Her scholarship had run out 3 weeks ago. Her lease on the studio apartment 2 blocks from campus was up at the end of the month. She had $412 in her checking account, a master's thesis on Victorian archival practices that was 2 chapters from completion, and no plan beyond the next 14 days. She opened the letter. The law firm of Greer and Associates informed her in the measured language of people who delivered news of this magnitude on a regular basis that her maternal grandmother, Ruth Elaine Whitmore, had passed away 6 weeks prior at the age of 78. Ruth Whitmore had been the sole owner and operator of Whitmore Creek Ranch, 420 acres in the foothills of the Beartooth Range, Big Sky Country, Montana. She had run it for 41 years. She had run it alone for the last 19 after her husband Earl died of a heart attack in the South pasture on a Wednesday morning in early spring. Clara had never met Ruth Whitmore. Her mother had left Montana at 17 and never looked back, and the silence between mother and grandmother had been total and permanent. Clara knew almost nothing about the woman whose last name she carried. She knew she was somewhere out there alive in a state Clara had driven through once on a cross-country trip and remembered only as an ocean of grass under an impossibly large sky. Now Ruth Whitmore was gone, and she had left Clara everything. There was a condition. Clara read it twice. Then a third time, moving her lips slightly, the way she did when she encountered a passage she needed to understand precisely. The condition was this: to receive full legal title to Whitmore Creek Ranch. Clara Whitmore was required to travel to Montana, present herself at the ranch in person, and sign what the document called the 90-day residency and work agreement, referred to in the accompanying pages as the bride contract. The language was formal and old-fashioned, the kind of language that belonged to a different century. Clara would arrive at the ranch as its prospective heir. She would live in the main house. She would learn the operation of the ranch under the guidance of the men currently employed there. She would complete 90 days of full residency and active participation. At the end of that period, if she chose to remain, the ranch would become hers outright with all assets, livestock, and equipment included. If she chose to leave at any point before the 90 days were complete, or if she chose not to come at all, the property would be sold at public auction, with proceeds distributed according to a separate schedule. The men currently employed at the ranch had each signed a corresponding document committing to her protection, her instruction, and her fair treatment during the 90 days. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. Outside the library windows, Boston moved through its afternoon. Buses, bicycles, students with coffee cups, the ordinary machinery of a world that had no idea anything had changed. She thought about her $412. She thought about her expiring lease. She thought about the fact that her mother, when Clara had tried once to ask about Montana, had looked at her with an expression so closed and final that Clara had never asked again. She thought about the word the document used: bride contract. She folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, and placed the envelope in her bag between her notebook and her copy of a library science textbook she'd been meaning to return for 6 months. Then she went back to cataloging agricultural journals, because that was what she did when she didn't know what else to do. She organized things. She put them in order. She made sense of what was in front of her. She gave her notice the next morning. The drive from Boston to Montana took 4 days. Clara listened to audiobooks about cattle ranching and land management, taking notes at rest stops in a small spiral notebook with color-coded tabs she had set up before leaving. By the time she crossed into Montana, she had filled 31 pages. She had a timeline. She had a list of questions. She had a plan. What she did not have was any clear picture of what she was walking into. The law firm's letter had specified that 4 men were employed at Whitmore Creek Ranch under long-term contracts with the estate. It had given their names Boone Calloway, Slade Merritt, Rafe Hale, Beckett, Ward. It had described the bride contract in detail, including the provision that all four had agreed to its terms and signed accordingly. Clara had read this carefully. She had read between the lines the way she had been trained to read, looking for structure, for implication, for what was said and what was deliberately not said. She had arrived at a conclusion: one of these men was the intended groom. The bride contract was named for a reason. Her grandmother had arranged something. One of them had agreed to marry her, or at least to the possibility of it, and the other three were simply part of the arrangement. It was an old-fashioned idea, strange even. But Clara had cataloged enough 19th century history to know that mail-order arrangements, formal contracts, practical marriages between strangers in remote places, these things had shaped the American West. Ruth Whitmore was 78 when she died. She had spent her whole life in Montana. It was possible, Clara thought, that the old ways ran deeper out here than anywhere else. She would meet the man. She would assess the situation. She would be rational and thorough and professional about the whole thing, and she would make a decision based on the evidence available. She repeated this to herself on the last stretch of road when the highway gave way to a two-lane, and the two-lane gave way to a gravel track that climbed steadily into foothills painted gold and rust with the last of the summer grass. The main house of Whitmore Creek Ranch appeared around a long curve in the road, and Clara stopped breathing for a moment. It was a log structure that looked as if it had grown from the earth rather than been built on it, witty and low and deeply settled into the land, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and a stone chimney at each end, like bookends holding the whole thing together. Behind it, barns and corrals spread across a valley floor, and beyond those, the land rose toward mountains that were still carrying snow on their upper ridges even now in late August. Four men stood on the porch. Clara pulled to a stop in the gravel drive and checked her reflection in the rearview mirror out of habit. Her hair was in its usual bun. Her cardigan was the sensible gray one. She looked exactly like what she was, a young woman from Boston who had spent the last 4 days in a car and the last 4 years in a library, and there was nothing to be done about that. She stepped out into air so clean it made her dizzy. The tallest of the four men came down the porch steps first. He moved the way the land looked, steady, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and intended to use it exactly as he chose. He was built along lines that suggested years of physical work, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair just long enough to curl at the collar of his shirt and eyes the color of winter clouds. He stopped a few feet from her car and hooked his thumbs through his belt loops and looked at her. "You must be the granddaughter," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to carry. "Boone Calloway. I run the operation here." Clara extended her hand the way she would to a department head. "Clara Whitmore, I appreciate you and your team maintaining the property during the transition. I've prepared some initial questions about the operation and—" Boone looked at her outstretched hand for a moment before taking it. His palm was calloused and warm and swallowed her hand completely. He shook once, brief and firm. "These are the others," he said, and gestured toward the porch. The three remaining men came down the steps in order. Slade Merritt was lean and angular, with cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows and hair the color of dark copper that he wore pushed back from his forehead. He did not extend his hand. He looked at her the way someone looks at a structural problem they haven't decided how to solve yet. Rafe Hale was quieter in his presence, somehow medium height, with the kind of stillness that Clara associated with people who had learned to observe before they acted, and eyes so dark they were almost black. He nodded at her. Just that. And Beckett Ward was the youngest, maybe late 20s, with an easy smile that reached his eyes and a dimple on the left side that probably got him out of more trouble than it had any right to. "Ma'am," they said nearly together, each touching the brim of his hat. Clara looked at the four of them. Then she pulled the letter from her bag. "I'd like to clarify the terms of the contract," she said, "specifically the section regarding the bride arrangement. I understand that one of you has agreed to Miss Whitmore." This was from the law firm's representative, a compact man in a dusty sedan who had apparently arrived just behind her and whom she had not noticed until now. He was walking towards her with a briefcase and the slightly apologetic expression of someone who knows they are about to say something complicated. "There are a few additional provisions in the contract that weren't included in the initial correspondence, if you'll allow me." He opened the briefcase. He removed a document and read from it in the way of a man who has read this particular passage before and has prepared himself for the response it generates. The bride contract, it turned out, did not specify a groom. It did not specify any romantic arrangement at all. The contract designated Clara as a prospective bride of the ranch itself to the land, to the operation, to the life. The four men had each signed the document not as suitors but as guarantors. They had pledged their knowledge, their labor, and their protection for the 90-day period. They had agreed to teach her everything she needed to know to run the property. At the end of 90 days, the land would be hers. Any other arrangements that developed during that period were in the exact language of Ruth Whitmore's final directive, left entirely to the natural course of things. Clara stood in the gravel drive of a ranch she had never seen until 20 minutes ago and looked at the document in the lawyer's hands and felt the very careful plan she had built across 4 days of driving quietly come apart at its seams. "There's no," she started, "no specified groom," the lawyer confirmed. "No required romantic component. The term reflects a traditional Montana arrangement in which a woman comes to a property to determine whether she is suited to it and it to her." She looked at Boone. His expression had not changed. "You knew this," she said. "Yes. And you didn't—" "It wasn't my letter to write." He looked at her steadily. "Your grandmother wanted you to come. She wanted you to understand what you were deciding about before you decided. That's what the 90 days are for." Clara looked at the document. She looked at the four men. She looked at the house behind them, the barns, the mountains, the sky that seemed twice the size of any sky she had ever stood under. She could get back in her car. She could drive to the airport in Billings. She could return to Boston with nothing except the knowledge that she had come this far and turned around, which was something she had never done in her life. She signed the contract on the lawyer's briefcase, standing in the gravel without sitting down. The first 3 days were a systematic dismantling of everything Clara believed she was capable of. She could not open the pasture gates. The chain and latch system that every man on the property operated with one hand, while barely breaking stride, defeated her for 20 minutes the first morning, until Beckett, watching from the truck with his arm resting on the window frame, finally said quietly, "Chain lifts up first, then out. Post swings toward you." She got it on the third try and her hands were already aching. She could not carry a full hay bale more than 30 feet without stopping. She could not read the ear tag system. She could not tell a cow that was 3 days from calving from one that had just calved, though Slade explained the difference in terms she was fairly certain a person of reasonable intelligence should have been able to retain. Boone said almost nothing to her directly those first days, which was somehow worse than criticism. He moved through the property with the kind of authority that required no performance, and when she was struggling, he did not offer assistance. He watched. He assessed. On the second evening, she overheard him say something quietly to Rafe while they were loading equipment, and though she couldn't make out the words, she understood the tone. It was the tone of a man who had expected exactly this and been confirmed. Clara had grown up with that tone. It had come from professors, from department heads, from every person who had ever looked at her careful plans, and her color-coded notes and her sensible shoes and concluded something before she had the chance to demonstrate anything. She had learned over 22 years that the only answer to that tone was to keep going until the evidence changed the conclusion. She kept going. By the end of day 3, she could open every gate on the south pasture route in under a minute. It was not impressive by the ranch's standards. By her own, it was a victory. Beckett noticed. He said nothing about it, but that evening he brought her coffee at the kitchen table without being asked, and the mug was the good one, the heavy ceramic one that held the heat, not the thin enamel cup he used for guests. On the 5th day, Clara found herself alone in the office off the main hallway, going through the financial ledgers for the first time. She had approached them the way she approached all documents, systematically beginning to end making notes. The margins were thin. Not dangerously so, but thin enough that a single bad season could tip the arithmetic in an uncomfortable direction. She was still sitting with this observation when she heard boots on the porch and Boone appeared in the doorway. She told him what she had found. The numbers, the margins, the vulnerability of it. He came into the room and stood with one hand on the doorframe looking at the open ledgers. He was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then he said, "Things that matter don't always pay the bills, but the things that only pay the bills don't always matter." He looked at her once brief and direct. "Your grandmother understood the difference. I'd suggest you spend some time with that before you make any conclusions." He was gone before she could form a response, and she sat alone in the office with the ledgers open in front of her and the echo of those two sentences rearranging something in how she was reading the numbers. On the seventh day, the morning was cold enough to see her breath, and Clara came out of the house at 5:45 to find the ranch yard already fully awake. Rafe was in the round pen with a young horse moving in slow, deliberate circles. Slade was loading the feed truck with the focused efficiency of a man who had done this particular task so many times it had become something close to meditation. Boone was coming out of the main barn with a look on his face that meant something needed attention. He stopped when he saw her. "You need boots," he said. "What you're wearing is going to cause problems." "I'm fine," Clara said, looking down at her canvas shoes, which were, she admitted privately, already damp from the morning grass. Boone looked at her feet for a moment in the way of a man who has no interest in arguing about things that have obvious answers. "Beckett," he said without raising his voice. Beckett appeared from the direction of the bunkhouse. "Yeah. Mudroom, bring her a pair." Clara opened her mouth to object and then closed it because Boone had already turned and walked back toward the barn, and the conversation was apparently over. Beckett came back 2 minutes later with a pair of boots that had been worn in and weathered to the soft, comfortable shape of regular use. Dark brown leather, plain and practical. "Try these," he said. Clara sat on the porch step and pulled them on. They fit perfectly. Not almost. Exactly. As if they had been made for her feet or had simply become, over years of use, the shape that her feet had always been meant to fill. She stood up. She felt different, more grounded. It was a small thing and an absurd thing to notice, but she noticed it. Boone came back around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw her standing there in the boots. Something moved across his face, a thing she couldn't name quick and then controlled. "Those were your grandmother's," he said. His voice was different when he talked about Ruth. Quieter, more careful, like a man handling something he didn't want to damage. "She was about your size." Clara looked down at the boots. She was wearing the boots of a woman she had never met, standing on land she had never seen in the middle of a life she had not anticipated. Something moved in her chest that she did not have words for yet. "Boone," she said. He looked at her. "She told you I would come. That's what you said when I arrived." "Yes." "What else did she tell you?" He was quiet for a moment. The morning light was coming over the eastern ridge, now that particular gold that belongs only to places where the sky is wide enough to let it in fully. The mountains were sharp and clear in the distance, and the cattle in the near pasture were moving slowly toward the water trough, and everything smelled like grass and cold air and pine. "She said she'd been watching you from a distance for years. Said she knew what kind of woman you were becoming." He paused. "Said I'd know you when I saw you." Clara didn't ask what that meant. She wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. "I'll be at the truck," he said and walked away. The second week moved differently than the first. The work was still hard, still precise in its demands, in ways that had nothing to do with anything Clara had trained for, but she was beginning to find the internal logic of it. Ranching, she was learning, was a classification system, just not one built from books. It was built from seasons and animals and land, from the understanding that everything was connected to everything else, and that a small error in one part of the system produced consequences 3 connections away. She understood systems. She understood the patience required to learn one from the inside. Slade was her primary teacher that second week, though teacher was not a word he would have used for himself. He took her on the morning check runs the way he took anyone who needed to learn something by doing the thing and expecting her to keep up and pay attention. He pointed things out without softening them. A cow favoring her left front leg standing apart from the herd in a way that telegraphed discomfort to anyone who knew what to look for. A section of fence where the wire was starting to sag, pulling at the post, the kind of failure that starts small and becomes expensive if you don't catch it early. He said one morning when Clara had successfully identified a calf that wasn't nursing, had spotted it herself before Slade pointed it out. "Your grandmother could read a herd from 100 yards. Took her 6 years to develop that eye." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her. Coming from Slade, it felt significant. "How long did it take you?" she asked. 3 years, he said. "But I grew up watching animals. You didn't." "That means I'm ahead of schedule," Clara said. Slade looked at her. For just a moment, the sharp edges of his face rearranged themselves into something that might, in a different light, have been the beginning of a smile. Then he looked away and started the truck. On the 14th day, 2 weeks and 76 days remaining, Clara was back in the small office off the main hallway, going through the ranch's handwritten ledgers with the careful attention she gave to archival materials, when she noticed the desk in a way she had not noticed it before. It was a large roll-top desk, old enough to have been here when the house was built, with the kind of presence that working furniture develops over decades of actual use. The surface held organized stacks of current documents. The cubby holes contained correspondence sorted by date. It was a librarian's desk, Clara realized, or at least it had been organized by someone who thought the way a librarian thought. She ran her hand along the top of the desk and felt the grain of the wood worn smooth at the corners and along the front edge where hands had rested 10,000 times. She opened the top right drawer. It held pens, a ruler, a bottle of ink that had dried long ago. She opened the second drawer. At the back, behind a stack of blank paper, was an envelope. It was a plain white envelope sealed with her name written across the front in handwriting she didn't recognize. Clear, upright letters. Deliberate. The ink was slightly different in shade from the financial documents she'd been reading, darker, as if written with a better pen. Beside the envelope, resting in the corner of the drawer, was a small key on a plain ring. The key was old, possibly brass, worn at its edges. Clara didn't recognize the kind of lock it would open. She sat with the envelope in her hands for a long moment. Her name was on it. It had been put there deliberately in a drawer of a desk that had been organized by someone meticulous enough to color sort correspondence. This was not an accident. This had been placed here for exactly this moment. She reached for the seal. "Miss Whitmore," she turned. Boone was standing in the doorway of the office, hat in hand, watching her. He had the particular quality of a man who has walked into a room and immediately understood everything significant that was happening in it. His eyes moved from her face to the envelope in her hands and back to her face. "She left that for you," he said. His voice carried the same careful quietness it always had when the subject was Ruth, the tone of a man who held the memory of someone with both hands and did not intend to be careless with it. "I know," Clara said. "It has my name on it." She also left instructions about it. Boone came into the room and stood across the desk from her, and Clara noticed that his hands, which were usually in motion working, adjusting, building, were still at his sides. She said, "Not yet. Not yet." "She said you'd know when you were ready, that the envelope would still be there, that the understanding you brought to it depended on what you'd learned before you opened it." Clara looked at the envelope. She looked at Boone. "And the key, I don't know what it opens," he said, which she did not entirely believe, but there was something in his expression that made her hold back the follow-up question. "She said you'd find out when it mattered." Clara put the envelope back in the drawer. She put the key beside it. She closed the drawer. "Fine," she said. Boone looked at her with an expression that might have been respect, if respect in this context could be mixed with something more complex that she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. "We're moving the herd to the upper pasture tomorrow morning," he said. "Early. You'll need to be ready." "I'll be ready," Clara said. He turned to leave. At the doorway he paused, the same way she had noticed. All four of them paused, sometimes at doorways and thresholds, as if the act of leaving a room warranted a moment of consideration. "Your grandmother built this house the year she turned 31, he said without turning around. "Framed it herself, hung every door. She said she wanted a house with thresholds that meant something. A place where the decision to enter or leave was always deliberate." He left. Clara sat alone in the office with the sound of the ranch settling around her, the distant low of cattle, the particular creak of a log structure adjusting to the evening temperature, the wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek bed. She thought about deliberate choices. She thought about a woman she had never met who had built something from bare ground and a conviction that it was worth building. She thought about the envelope in the drawer with her name on it waiting. She thought about how it felt to wear boots that fit perfectly, that belonged to someone she should have known and didn't, and how sometimes the things you inherit from people are not the things that are written into documents. Outside, the mountains were going dark at their bases while their peaks still held the last of the light, and somewhere in the lower pasture, Beckett was whistling something old and unhurried, and the sound of it carried a long way in the clean Montana evening. Clara Whitmore sat in her grandmother's chair at her grandmother's desk and understood for the first time, with the specific clarity that comes only from experience rather than research, that she was exactly 76 days away from a decision that no notebook, no timeline, and no color-coded plan was going to be able to make for her. The second month began the way all significant changes begin, not with a single moment, but with an accumulation of small ones, each unremarkable on its own, each essential to the whole. Clara stopped checking her phone for Boston news on the morning of day 17. She didn't decide to stop. She simply picked it up, looked at the screen, and found that nothing on it corresponded to anything she was currently thinking about. She set it face down on the nightstand and went outside, and the morning received her the way the ranch mornings always did, with indifference and beauty, in equal measure, the two things combining into something that felt increasingly like honesty. She was changing. She could feel it in the specific way she could feel a muscle she hadn't previously known. She possessed the awareness arriving only when something stressed it enough to make its presence known. Her hands had stopped aching. The calluses had come in quietly over the first 2 weeks, the skin thickening at the palm and along the inside of her fingers where the tools were at her, and now the work that had exhausted her in the first days simply cost her less. She was burning fuel she didn't know she had. She was learning the land. Not from books, though she still kept her notebook and still wrote in it every evening. She was learning it the way the land required from inside it, moving through it, making mistakes in it, and correcting them, and making different ones. She was learning it the way the men had learned it, which meant she was learning it slowly and specifically and without shortcuts. Slade taught her the cattle. He was not a patient teacher in the way that patience is usually understood, warm, encouraging, willing to repeat. He was patient the way a good instrument is patient, precise, and unsparing and consistent. He told her a thing once. He expected her to hold it. When she didn't, he told her again in exactly the same words, which she came to understand was not frustration, but methodology. If the first telling hadn't worked, the variables to change were her attention and her retention, not his delivery. He taught her to read the herd the way you read a room, the collective body language of 300 animals, organized by invisible social structures, the information available in who stood where and how, and in relation to whom. He taught her that cattle are honest in their discomfort and secretive in their illness, that the ones you needed to watch were the ones that had gone quiet and still in a herd that was moving. He taught her the land itself, the 4 sections, their water sources, the fence lines, the places where the grass had always grown thinner, and why the places where the soil held moisture long after a rain. He taught her to read the sky the way his own teachers had taught him the particular cloud formations that meant weather coming in from the northwest, the shift in the wind off the mountains that preceded rain by roughly 4 hours. He taught her without sentiment. But Clara was a careful reader, and she noticed things that Slade did not say. She noticed that he knew the name and history of every cow in the main herd, not from records but from memory, the kind of memory that comes from years of daily attention. She noticed that when a calf was struggling, something in his face changed in a way he would have denied if asked about it. She noticed that he drove the fence line on his own on Sunday evenings after the week's work was done, not because it was required, but because he wanted to know everything was intact. One evening in the 3rd week, she asked him how long he'd been at Whitmore Creek. He was quiet for a moment. They were sitting on the tailgate of the truck after a long afternoon in the north pasture, watching the light go sideways across the grass. 14 years, he said. You came when you were 17. Yes. And before that? It was not quite a question. He looked at her for a moment, and she held the silence the way he had taught her to hold a gate firmly without forcing it. Before that was different, he said. He looked back at the pasture. Your grandmother gave me work when I had nothing else. No family, no place, no reason to think things were going to go in any particular direction. He paused. She didn't ask about my history. She handed me a pair of gloves and showed me what needed doing. That was the whole speech. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Clara said. She was the best person I ever met, Slade said, and there was no performance in it, no sentiment dressed up as statement. It was simply true, and he said it the way he said all true things, directly without apology. Clara thought about that for a long time after they drove back to the ranch. Rafe taught her the horses. This was the education Clara had expected to fear the most, and it was instead the one that opened something in her that she hadn't known was closed. Rafe worked with horses the way certain people work with language, from the inside through understanding, rather than force, with the recognition that real communication between two different kinds of being requires the humility to accept that you are not the only one doing the interpreting. He started with Sage, the gray mare that had been Ruth Whitmore's horse, steady and wise in the way of animals who have been well treated for a long time and have developed opinions about the people they carry. Sage had assessed Clara from the beginning with those dark liquid eyes that seemed to see considerably more than was comfortable, and in the first days had simply tolerated her presence the way a senior employee tolerates a new hire who does not yet understand the workplace culture. Rafe showed her how to stand with a horse, which was not the same as standing near one, how to let the animal set the pace of familiarity rather than reaching for contact that hadn't been offered, how to read the small language of ears and eyes, in the particular angle of a head, the information available in the set of a bum, or the movement of a tail, or the way weight shifted from one hip to the other. "She's telling you something right now," Rafe said one morning, standing beside Clara at the round pen fence. "What is it?" Clara watched Sage. The mare was standing at the far end of the pen, head low. One hip dropped, her eyes soft and her breathing easy. The whole shape of her communicated a settled quietness, a comfort in the present moment. "She's relaxed," Clara said. "She's not worried about anything." Rafe said nothing, which she had learned meant she was correct. And if she were worried, head would come up, ears forward or pinned back. She'd be moving. He looked at her. "3 weeks ago, you didn't know the front end from the back." "I knew the front end from the back," Clara said. "I just didn't know what they were saying." He almost smiled. It was a thing she had come to watch for the way his face organized itself when something struck him as precisely right. It lasted about 2 seconds and then was gone, but it was genuine while it lasted, and it meant more, she had decided, than the expressions of men who smiled readily and at everything. By the end of the 4th week, she was riding Sage on her own through the eastern pastures, and the fear she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by something she could only describe it as conversation. The ongoing negotiation of weight and balance and direction between a woman who was learning and a horse who was choosing to teach. A new horse arrived at the ranch in the 5th week. A bay mare young with a white blaze down her face and the watchful, intelligent eyes of an animal that has been in enough difficult situations to have developed opinions about the world. Rafe said she had been mishandled somewhere before she came to them. He said it simply without dramatics, the way he said things that were true and unfortunate, but required acknowledgement rather than elaboration. Clara watched Rafe work with her one morning from the fence rail. The mare circled the round pen with that particular wariness that comes not from aggression, but from sustained uncertainty, the posture of a creature that has learned to prepare for the worst because the worst has happened before. "What will you name her?" Clara asked. Rafe kept his eyes on the horse, his movements unhurried and deliberate. "We've been leaving her unnamed," he said, waiting to see what suits her. He glanced at Clara briefly. "The right name comes from knowing someone. You can't rush it." Clara watched the bay mare move. Something in the quality of the animal's wariness, the specific kind of alertness that comes from a creature that wants to trust, but has learned to be careful about it, struck her as familiar in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. "I don't have one yet," she said, "but I think I'll know it when it's time." Rafe nodded as if that was the correct answer and turned back to the horse. Beckett taught her everything else. This was not how he would have described it. He would have said he cooked the food and kept the books and made sure the supply runs happened on schedule, which was all true. But Beckett also paid attention to people the way Rafe paid attention to horses closely, without announcing it, with the genuine interest of someone for whom other people were endlessly worth understanding. He knew when she was running low before she knew herself. Coffee appeared at the kitchen table before she asked for it on the mornings when the previous day's work had stacked up in her muscles, and her eyes were slower than usual to focus. On the evenings when the ledgers or the planning or the weight of 90 days of decision made the main house feel too quiet and too large. He appeared with something he was cooking that required company, or a question about the records she was digitizing, or simply a story about something that had happened on the ranch that week. He was 28, and he had the ease of a man who had accepted himself some time ago and found the experience restful. He made no large claims. He did not speak about his past with the guarded quality that characterized both Slade and Rafe. When Clara asked him sometime in the 5th week what had brought him to Whitmore Creek, he said simply that he had made a series of poor decisions in his middle 20s, and Ruth Whitmore had offered him a way to make different ones, and that he had taken it, and that he considered this the most significant piece of luck in his life. She had a talent for that, Clara said. She had a talent for a lot of things, Beckett said. He was chopping vegetables at the kitchen counter, his back half turned to her. But mostly she had a talent for seeing what people actually were instead of what they looked like on the surface. It's rarer than it sounds. What did she see in you? He glanced back at her. Someone worth the trouble, he said, which at the time was considerably more than I believed myself. And Boone. Boone did not teach her the way the others taught her. Boone pushed her, which was a different thing, and more uncomfortable, and ultimately more necessary. He set the standard for the operation, and he expected her to meet it not because he was indifferent to her difficulty, but because he understood in the way that people who have been held to high standards understand that the only way to know what you're capable of is to be required to find out. He was hardest on her when she was most tired, which she eventually understood was not cruelty, but a form of specific preparation. The ranch would not be gentler with her when she was exhausted. The cattle did not restructure their needs around her energy levels. The fence did not wait for a better day. He was teaching her to function at the edge of herself, which was the most important lesson and the least comfortable. But she noticed things about him too. She noticed that he was the last one to leave a pasture and the first one back to it, that he carried the weight of the operation with a seriousness that went beyond employment, the seriousness of someone who has identified their purpose and organized his life around it. That when something went wrong on the ranch, his expression, when he thought no one was watching, was not frustration, but something older and more complicated. Something that looked from a distance like grief. She was thinking about this on the morning of day 45, when the truck she didn't recognize came up the gravel drive. It was a clean truck, too clean for these roads, and the man who got out of it was wearing a suit jacket over a collared shirt with no tie. The particular combination that communicated someone who wanted to appear both serious and approachable and had not entirely succeeded at either. He was carrying a slim leather portfolio. Clara was on the porch with her coffee and the morning ledger. She watched him approach and felt something change in the quality of the morning, the way weather changes, it not yet arrived but already present in the air. Miss Whitmore, he extended a card before she could stand. Garrett Bowl Vantage Land Corporation. I was hoping to have a few minutes of your time. She looked at the card. The logo was clean and corporate, the address Denver. Regarding, she said, the property, he said. He said it pleasantly with the pleasant confidence of someone who has had this conversation many times and has prepared for all the ways it tends to go. Vantage has a significant interest in the Whitmore Creek acreage. I'd like to present you with a formal offer. Clara became aware at the edge of her vision that Slade had come out of the equipment barn and had stopped walking. Garrett Bowl took papers from his portfolio. The number at the top of the first page was one that Clara, who had been studying the ranch's financials with the same precision she brought to everything, understood immediately. It was more than twice the property's assessed value. It was enough to clear every debt she had accumulated through 7 years of higher education and still have enough remaining to fund several years of a different kind of life entirely. She was 22 years old. She had $412 in her checking account. She had $76,000 in student debt. She looked at the number on the page. She was still looking at it when Slade reached the porch. Miss Whitmore doesn't need to see that, he said. His voice was flat and controlled in the way that flat and controlled voices are when the alternative is something much less contained. Mr. Bull started. Merritt, Slade Merritt. He looked at the man from Denver with an expression Clara had not seen on his face before, and she had seen Slade's face in many circumstances by now. This was different. This was old. Vantage Land, Big Sky Acquisitions Division. That's right. Bull was reassessing, adjusting his approach with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to adjusting. You're one of the employees. I understand this must feel uncertain. Go back to Denver, Slade said. It was not a request. The 4 words landed in the morning air with the weight of something final, and Bull felt it. Clara could see that. He looked at Slade. He looked at Clara. He placed his card on the porch railing with deliberate calm. The offer stands, he said. Miss Whitmore, when you are ready to discuss it, please call directly. He walked back to his clean truck. He drove away. Clara looked at the card on the railing. She looked at Slade. He was already walking away back toward the equipment barn, His shoulders held in that tight, particular way that meant something was happening inside him that he had no intention of making visible. Slade, she called. He did not stop. She went after him. The equipment barn was dim and smelled like oil and metal, and Slade was standing at a workbench with his back to her, his hands flat on the surface, not working on anything, just standing. "What just happened?" Clara said. "Nothing that concerns you." His voice was careful and exact. "It happened on my porch with a man who came to buy my land," Clara said. "That seems like it concerns me." He turned. She had not been wrong about his expression. He had been keeping it controlled, and the control was intact, but the cost of it was visible now in the tightness around his jaw, the stillness of a man who is holding something with both hands. "You're considering it," he said. "I saw your face when you looked at that number." "I'm 22 years old with $76,000 in student debt," Clara said. "I looked at a large number. That's not the same as a decision." "Vantage Land Corporation bought my father's ranch," Slade said. "Kootenai County. I was 14 years old." He said it the way he said everything directly without decoration. "We were behind on the mortgage. 2 bad seasons back to back. They moved in with an offer, then another offer, then lawyers, then paperwork. I don't think my father fully understood until it was too late. He was out of that land in 4 months." He paused. "He didn't survive the year after." Clara was very still. "I went into the county system at 15, Slade said. At 17 with nothing but a bad attitude, which is what the social worker's report actually said. Ruth hired me that same month. She didn't ask what the report said." He looked at Clara. "Vantage doesn't buy ranches. They buy acreage. They break up the land, sell it to developers, subdivide it into vacation properties for people who will visit twice, and spend the rest of the year paying property taxes on a place they never intended to actually inhabit." His voice was still level. "They are very good at it." Clara held his gaze. "I'm not selling," she said. "You looked at that number." "I looked at a number," she said. "I didn't say yes to it. There's a distance between those two things that I think you understand, given that you just stood in front of that man and told him to leave without asking me first." Something shifted in him. It was small, it was real. "You're right," he said. "That wasn't my call." "No," she said, "but the reason you made it was." She left him there. She did not look back, which was something she was still learning, when to leave a silence intact, when the most complete statement was the absence of one. She went to find Rafe. She found him at the far end of the barn, working with the bay mare she had been watching from the fence rail for 2 weeks. The mare was quieter than she had been when she arrived. She stood at Rafe's shoulder without flinching, her eyes watchful but no longer braced for something to go wrong. "The key," Clara said. Rafe turned to look at her. "The one my grandmother left in the desk drawer. She said I'd find out what it opened when it mattered." She paused. "When I came in 3 weeks ago, you were finishing the saw at the far end of the barn, the one with the tack chest I haven't been able to open." Rafe was quiet for a moment. He looked at her the way he looked at everything carefully without rushing to a conclusion. Then he reached into the front pocket of his shirt and withdrew a small key on a plain ring. Worn brass-soled, its edges smooth with years of handling. He held it out. "I found it," he said in the spring when I resaddled Sage for the first time after Ruth passed. "Under the lining of the saddle. She'd sewn it in." Clara took the key from his hand. It was lighter than she expected. "You kept it," she said. "It wasn't mine to open," he said. "Neither was the desk." She went to the far stall. The tack chest was old pine with iron fittings, unremarkable among the other storage of the barn, which was perhaps why she hadn't given it specific attention. The lock was small and brass and tarnished. She fit the key in. It turned without resistance, smooth and easy the way locks turn when they have been made well and maintained. Inside the chest, beneath 2 folded wool blankets that still held the particular smell of cedar and age, was a journal. The cover was dark green cloth, worn pale at the corners. There was no title, no date on the outside. Clara opened it and read the first line. "Clara, I do not know when you will read this, but I have written it for a time when you are ready to hear it, and I trust that you will know when that is." She sat down on the floor of the stall, her back against the wall, the bay mare watching her from across the aisle with those liquid, cautious eyes, and she read, Ruth Whitmore wrote the way she had organized her desk precisely without waste, with the understanding that every word was carrying weight and should be selected accordingly. She wrote about the ranch and the land and the 41 years she had spent building something that was worth building. She wrote about the four men she had gathered to her over the years, each one brought to her at a point of fracture in his life, each one given work and expectation and the specific dignity of being trusted with something that mattered. She wrote about Clara. I have watched you from a distance longer than you know. I know who raised you and how, and I know that what you did not receive as a child was not love itself, but the particular quality of love that sees you clearly and holds you accountable and believes in you without requiring you to be small. I designed the 90 days for exactly that reason. The men on this property have learned to give that kind of love because I required it of them, and they were capable of it and did not yet know they were. I believe you are capable of receiving it, and I believe that you do not yet know that either. She wrote about the bride contract. I use the old language deliberately. I want you to arrive as a woman who has chosen, not as an heir who has inherited. There is a difference between those two things that I believe you understand in your work, even if you have not yet applied it to your life. You have spent your years cataloging other people's stories with great care and intelligence. It is time to begin the work of your own. The men on this ranch are part of that work. How and in what way is entirely yours to determine. I have only made sure that they are there and that they are worthy of being found. Clara read the journal from the first page to the last, which took an hour and a half. When she was finished, she sat for a long time in the quiet of the barn, with the evening coming through the gaps in the boards and the smell of hay and horse and old wood around her. She thought about a woman she had never met who had thought about her with that kind of care and that kind of intention, who had arranged all of this, the contract, the men, the boots, the key, the journal, not as a test but as a gift, the most complex and considered gift anyone had ever given her. She thought about Slade standing at the workbench with his hands on the surface, holding something old and painful with both hands, while a man in a suit jacket stood on her porch. She thought about what it costs a person to watch the machinery that destroyed something essential in their life walk up a gravel drive and smile pleasantly. She thought about Boone's face when he saw her wearing the boots. She thought about Beckett's coffee and Rafe's almost smile, and the way Sage had stopped testing her somewhere around week 3 and started simply carrying her the way a horse does when it has decided you are worth trusting. She came out of the barn at dusk and found all 4 of them on the porch of the main house, which was where they gathered in the evenings, when the week had been long and the work was done and the quality of the light made it natural to stop moving and simply be somewhere. She sat down in her grandmother's rocking chair. She set the journal on her knee. None of them asked about it, which told her that Rafe had said something, or that Boone had seen her going into the barn, or simply that these were men who understood when to give a thing room. The light went from gold to copper to the deep blue that precedes dark, and the mountains held their shapes against the sky, and the cattle were quiet in the lower pasture. After a long time, Beckett said, 30 days left. Clara looked at him. As of tomorrow morning, he said. His voice was easy as always, but his eyes were not. 60 days in, 30 to go. He paused. Seems like a moment worth marking. Boone said nothing. Slade was looking at the mountains. Rafe had his elbows on his knees, his hands loose between them, his eyes on the near distance. I read her journal, Clara said. No one spoke. She wrote about all of you, she said. She wrote about what she saw in each of you, what she hoped for. She stopped. She wrote about me, things about me she couldn't have known unless she'd been paying attention to a person she'd never met for a very long time. She paid attention to everything, Boone said quietly. I know that now, Clara said. I understand the desk now, the way she organized it. She looked at her hands in the low light, the calluses, the small scar from the 3rd week's fence work. She organized things the way I organize things. Because when you love something, you want it to last. You want it to be findable. You want someone to be able to come after you and understand what mattered. She looked at Slade. He was already looking at her. I'm not selling, she said. I told you that this morning and I meant it. But I want you to know I'm not saying it because of the number on that page or because of Vantage or because of anything external. I'm saying it because 60 days ago I arrived here with a plan that had nothing to do with this place and everything to do with a life that was waiting for me somewhere else, and I cannot identify that life anymore when I try to picture it. It has become abstract. This, she gestured at the ranch, the mountains, the dark coming in, this is not abstract. The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes after something true has been said in the presence of people who recognize truth when they hear it. Beckett said very quietly, 30 days. 30 days, Clara said. She did not say what she would do with them. She did not say what she was becoming or what she was beginning to understand about these four men and about herself and about the grandmother she had never met who had seen something worth arranging all of this for. She did not need to. The ranch settled around them in the dark, and the stars came out over the Beartooth Range in their thousands, and in the morning there would be work, and the work would be there the morning after, and the morning after that, and the question of what came next was 30 days away and closing. And for the first time in her life, Clara Whitmore did not reach for her notebook. She sat in her grandmother's chair in her grandmother's boots, and she let the not knowing rest in her chest without trying to catalog it or classify it or assign it a number in a system she had not yet built. It was the hardest thing she had learned to do on this ranch. It was also she was beginning to understand the most important. The morning of day 61 arrived without ceremony, the way the most consequential mornings always do. Clara was already awake when the light began. She had been awake most of the night not from anxiety in its familiar form, the kind that circles and doubles back and feeds on its own energy, but from something quieter and more demanding. A kind of reckoning that required wakefulness, the way serious work requires good light. She had been sitting at her grandmother's desk with the ranch ledgers spread before her, not reading them for the first time, but reading them differently than she had before. In the early weeks, she had approached them as financial documents, which they were assessing margins and cash flow and the thin arithmetic of an operation that ran close to the bone year after year. She had seen the precariousness and had categorized it as risk. Now she read them as biography. 41 years of Ruth Whitmore's handwriting, the entries changing subtly across the decades, the early years cramped and economical, as if she were aware of the cost of ink. The later ones more settled, more spacious, the handwriting of a woman who had earned the right to take up room. Bad years recorded without drama, good years without celebration. The tone throughout was the same. Here is what happened, and here is what it cost, here is what comes next. A woman who understood that the story was not in any single entry, but in the accumulation of all of them, the long proof of a life sustained by choice, renewed daily. She thought about what Boone had said on the fifth evening when she had shown him what she'd found in the ledgers. Things that matter don't always pay the bills, but the things that only pay the bills don't always matter. She had cataloged that remark in a section of her mind, marked uncertain, the kind of statement that sounds like wisdom but resists measurement. She understood now that it was not resistant to measurement at all. It was simply using a different scale, tracking different values across a longer span of time, and the proof of its accuracy was in her hands in 41 years of entries that together added up to something that a single column of numbers could never fully represent. She was still sitting there when the phone rang. It was the law firm. 7:42 in the morning, which meant someone had arrived at the office early and decided the call could not wait. The attorney's name was Gerald Crane, and he had the careful voice of a man delivering news he has rehearsed. Vintage Land Corporation had filed a formal purchase offer through the estate. The offer was legally valid under the terms of the original will. And there was a provision in the 90-day residency agreement, a provision on page 11, paragraph 4, which Clara had read and noted and filed in the section of her memory marked unlikely contingencies, that if a legitimate purchase offer arrived before the completion of the 90-day period, the heir had 72 hours to respond with a binding decision. Not 30 days, 72 hours. The clock had started at midnight. Clara set the phone down on the desk and looked at the window. The first gray light of morning was in the glass, the mountains beginning to separate themselves from the dark. She counted backward from midnight. She had 60 hours remaining. She went outside. The ranch yard was in its first motion of the day, the animals and the light and the land doing what they did every morning without reference to 72-hour deadlines or corporate purchase offers or the particular situation of a young woman from Boston who had arrived here 61 days ago with color-coded files and a sensible plan. The ranch did not adjust its schedule to human urgency. This had been one of its earliest lessons, and it was still, she thought, one of its most clarifying. Boone was at the main barn. He always was at this hour the first and last man at the work every day, a consistency so complete it had stopped registering as individual choice and had become simply part of the structure of the place, like the mountains at the edge of the valley. He saw her coming across the yard and read something in the way she was walking because he set down what he was holding and waited. She told him about the call. He listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the near pasture where the morning herd was beginning to move. "We knew this was a possibility," he said. "You knew. It's in the document. Ruth put it there." He paused. She put everything in the document deliberately. Every provision. Clara looked at him. Why would she put a provision that could force a decision before the 90 days were complete? Boone was quiet for longer than usual. The morning was doing what Montana mornings do in late October, the air clean and cold enough to see breath, the light coming hard and low from the east, throwing long shadows from the fence posts across the frost-white grass. "I think," he said finally, because she knew that some decisions don't get easier with more time, that sometimes what a person needs is not more information, but a reason to stop gathering it and choose. Clara looked at him. "Did she tell you that?" "Not in those words." He picked up what he'd set down, a bridle in need of repair, the leather dark and supple in his hands. "But I knew her for 22 years. I knew how she thought about things." 22 years. Clara had been alive for exactly that long. She stood in the cold morning and understood for the first time with her full attention what it meant that this man had spent her entire lifetime building his life around this place. Not as an employee building seniority, as a person who had found the thing that organized everything else and had committed to it with the seriousness that serious things deserve. "Tell the others," she said. "I want everyone to know the situation." He nodded. She went back to the house. The day passed in its work because the ranch required that it pass in work regardless of anything else. And Clara found that the physical demands of the day were not an impediment to thinking but a structure for it. She fixed fence in the morning with a Slade, the two of them working in the particular efficient silence they had developed over 60 days of shared labor, the wire and the posts and the cold air and the mountains. Slade did not mention the offer. She had not expected him to. He had said what he needed to say the day before in the equipment barn, with his hands on the workbench and the cost of old history visible in his face. What he said today was said through work, the way he handed her tools without being asked. The way he checked her technique on a fence strainer, not because she needed correction, but because checking was how he showed attention, and attention was how he showed that something mattered to him. She worked horses with Rafe in the afternoon. The bay mare came to her at the center of the round pen without being called, simply walked across the dirt and put her nose against Clara's shoulder and breathed there warm and steady. Rafe, leaning on the fence rail, said nothing. His expression said everything. "She decided to trust me," Clara said. No," Rafe said. "She recognized that you'd already decided to be trustworthy. She's been waiting to see if it would last." He paused. It lasted. Clara stood in the round pen with the mare breathing against her shoulder and thought about decisions that last. About the difference between a choice made once and a choice made every day, renewed by every action that follows, it tested by every circumstance that challenges it. About what it meant to be trustworthy, not as a characteristic, but as a practice. She looked at the bay mare's white blaze, the way the marking curved down the center of her face like a clean line drawn between two equal halves. Something about the horse had always reminded her of the quality she was still working toward, herself, the capacity to be open without being fragile, to have been broken and become steady rather than brittle. Grace. The word arrived in her mind quietly, the way right words do not proposed but recognized. She held it for a moment, said nothing yet. That evening, as the light went horizontal and the temperature dropped toward freezing, all five of them gathered inside for the first time. Not on the porch with the cold coming off the mountains, but in the main room where Beckett had lit the fire in the river rock fireplace that took up most of the north wall, and the cast iron skillet of cornbread sat cooling on the kitchen counter, and the room held the warmth the way the log walls had been built to hold it completely without draft. They all knew about the 72 hours. Nobody had said so directly. Nobody needed to. Boone settled into the chair near the fire. Slade sat on the far end of the couch with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slowly between his fingers in the way he did when something was sitting heavy. Rafe had taken the chair by the east window, his posture still, but not rigid, the quality of attention he brought to everything present in the room. Beckett was at the edge of the kitchen, leaning against the counter, the cornbread behind him, sending the smell of butter and cast iron into the warm air. Clara sat in the center of it all, in the chair that had been Ruth's, and for a moment she simply took in the scene. The fire, the men, the house around them, the dark outside, carrying the particular stillness of Montana in late autumn, when the cold has settled in and the land is waiting for snow. Boone spoke first. "I've been trying to think," he said, "about how to make the case for this place in a way that would hold up to the kind of analysis you're trained to do." He was looking at the fire. "I've been trying to find the argument that's airtight, the one that stands up to the number on that piece of paper." Clara waited. "I don't have it," he said. "The number is real. The margins are thin. It's a hard life, and it's going to get harder in some ways before it gets easier, and there's no version of an honest presentation where I can tell you the risk isn't genuine." He turned to look at her, then those gray eyes direct and without performance. "What I can tell you is what that number on that piece of paper doesn't include. It doesn't include the fact that every person in this room has built their life around this land, not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they chose to stay. It doesn't include the fact that Ruth Whitmore took 6 cows and bare acreage and 40 years of unrepeatable effort and made something that has outlasted her." He paused. "It doesn't include what you are now compared to what you were 60 days ago." "I can see that myself," Clara said quietly. "I know you can." He looked back at the fire. "I'm not making the rational case. I'm telling you that Ruth built this house with thresholds that meant something because she understood that the decisions made at thresholds shape everything that follows. Whatever you decide in the next 60 hours, you need to make it from the inside of this place, not from the outside looking at a number on paper." His voice went quieter. "That's all I have." It was more than he had ever said to her at one time. The room was very still except for the fire. Beckett said in his easy voice that never quite hid the intelligence behind it, "For what it's worth, I've been taking business courses online for 3 years. I have a plan for the operational efficiency that would change the margin situation significantly. I just never had reason to present it because it wasn't my ranch to improve." He paused. "It could be." Slade said nothing. He was looking at his hands, at the hat turning between his fingers. Then he said, 14 years ago, I didn't have a reason to be anywhere. I have one now. I'd like to keep having one." Rafe said even more quietly, "The mayor came to her today." Nobody explained what that meant. Nobody needed to. Clara sat with all of it, with the warmth of the fire and the smell of the cornbread and the dark pressed against the windows, and 4 men who had each in their own way, with their own language, in their own specific understanding of what they were offering, placed something in her hands without demanding anything in return for placing it there. She went to the office. She sat down at Ruth Whitmore's desk. She did not open the ledgers. She did not take out her notebook. She did not make a list or a plan or a timeline or any of the organizing systems she had used for 22 years to make the world manageable. She simply sat in the chair in the house that Ruth Whitmore had built and let the house be around her. Its log walls and its stone fireplaces, and its high ceilings that held the cold out, and the warmth in the Navajo rugs on the floors, worn soft with decades of use, the smell of pine and leather and wood smoke that she had stopped noticing somewhere around week 4 because it had become simply the smell of where she lived. She sat there until midnight. Then she sat there 3 hours more. At 5 in the morning, as the sky outside the east window began its first lightning, Clara Whitmore picked up the phone and called Gerald Crane at the law firm. He answered on the second ring. People who handle time-sensitive matters learn to keep their phones close. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'm declining the Vantage offer," she said. "I want to formally notify you of my intention to complete the 90-day residency and claim full title to Whitmore Creek Ranch. Can you initiate the confirmation paperwork today?" A pause, then, "I can have documents ready by 10 this morning." "I'll come to your office," she said. She hung up the phone and sat for another moment in the quiet of the house. Through the window, the mountains were beginning to define themselves against the sky, the familiar silhouettes she had come to know, the way you know the faces of people you see every day, specifically without effort, as part of the permanent landscape of your life. She went to find Boone. He was as always at the barn. He turned when he heard her footsteps and read her face in the way he read everything on the ranch immediately and accurately, and without requiring confirmation. "I called the lawyer," she said. "I'm signing the papers this morning." Something happened in his face. It was brief and then it was controlled, but she was standing close enough, and the early light was clear enough, and she knew him well enough by now that she saw the thing that lived behind the authority and the guardedness in the 22 years of careful maintenance of this place. It was relief. It was the specific relief of someone who has been holding a weight for a longer time and has just been told they can set it down. He nodded. He said, "I'll get the others." The drive to Sheridan took 40 minutes on roads that Clara now navigated without looking at her phone. She knew this country now. Not all of it, and not deeply. Not the way the four men who had spent years walking every acre of it knew it. But she knew the shapes of it, the way it moved through seasons, the way the light fell on it at different hours and from different angles. She knew it the way you begin to know a language when you have been living inside it long enough, imperfectly with gaps, but genuinely from the inside out. All four of them came with her. This had not been discussed. They had simply appeared at the truck one after another and gotten in. Gerald Crane's office was on the second floor of a brick building on Main Street with a view of the Bighorn Mountains from the east window and the kind of furniture that communicated seriousness without displaying wealth. He had the documents ready as promised, laid out in order on the conference table, with the particular precision of a man who has prepared many signings and understands that the physical arrangement of papers carries its own meaning. Clara read every page. This took 22 minutes. The four men sat around the table and waited, and nobody suggested she was taking too long, because they were men who understood that thoroughness was not the same as delay. She reached the final section. She had read this document in its original form in Boston 4 months ago. She had read it 3 times on the drive out. She had referenced specific provisions at least a dozen times during the 90 days. She was familiar with its structure and its language and the things it contained. She had not read the final addendum. It was a separate page attached at the back, dated 6 months before Ruth Whitmore died. Gerald Crane explained that per the terms of the will, this addendum was only to be disclosed and made legally effective upon the signing of the final inheritance confirmation upon the moment Clara chose to stay. Clara read it. The addendum directed that upon Clara's signing, each of the 4 men currently employed at Whitmore Creek Ranch, Boone Calloway, Slade Merritt, Rafe Hale, and Beckett Ward, would receive a 10% equity stake in the property. Not as compensation, not as a bonus. The language Ruth Whitmore had used was specific and deliberate, as her language always was. As family, because that is what they are, and because the people who build a thing with their hands and their years and their loyalty deserve to own a portion of what they have helped to make. The room was very quiet. Clara looked up from the document. She looked at the 4 men around the table. Boone was reading the page she had set down. His hands were still on the table. The hands that had worked this land for 22 years, that had fixed its fences and managed its cattle and carried its weight through bad seasons and worse ones, were absolutely still on the polished wood of the conference table, and she could see with perfect clarity that they were not quite steady. Slade had turned away from the table. He was looking at the wall to his left, and she could see the side of his jaw and the particular tension in it that she had learned to read, and she understood that he was doing what he always did when something cut through his defenses. He was taking a moment to get himself back behind them, because that was how he was built, and the process required privacy that a conference table could not provide, but that she could choose to honor by not looking directly at him. She looked instead at Rafe, who had his eyes closed. His face was more open than she had ever seen it, the careful observational stillness he maintained as a matter of habit, temporarily set aside, replaced by an expression that was simple and unguarded. He looked in this moment like a man who has been given something he had stopped allowing himself to want. Beckett was crying without apparent embarrassment, the tears coming quietly and without drama. And when he noticed Clara looking at him, he smiled the way he smiled when something was both funny and serious at the same time. He said, "She always did have better timing than any of us." Clara signed the document. Then she signed the addendum. Gerald Crane witnessed both signatures, applied the necessary notarizations, and organized the completed documents into their folder with the meticulous care of a man who understands that some paperwork is more than paperwork. He shook Clara's hand. He shook each of the men's hands in turn. He said something appropriate and well-chosen about Ruth Whitmore's legacy, and it was true enough that it deserved to be said, and Clara thanked him for it. They drove back to the ranch in the late morning light. Nobody spoke much on the drive. This was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but of people who have more to say than the drive home can hold, who have agreed without discussing it to wait for the right place in the right air and the right amount of sky overhead. Whitmore Creek Ranch came into view around the long curve in the road, and Clara felt something she had felt on the first day, the way the house seemed to have grown from the earth rather than been placed on it. The wide porch and the stone chimneys and the barns and corrals spreading across the valley floor, and the mountains standing permanent and clear in every direction. It was different now, not because anything about it had changed, but because her relationship to it had, and relationships are half of what you see when you look at anything. Boone was the first one out of the truck. He stood in the gravel drive for a moment looking at the house, and Clara watched him and thought about 22 years, about what it means to love something with that constancy, about what it costs to spend a significant portion of your life holding something in trust for someone who might not come or might not stay. She came and stood beside him. "She knew you'd be here," she said. "When she wrote that addendum, she knew you'd still be here when I came." "I wasn't going anywhere," he said. "I know, yeah, no." She looked at the house. "She knew that too. She trusted you with the whole thing. The land, the operation, all four of you. She trusted you to hold it until I found my way here." She paused. "That's not a small thing." "No," he said. "It isn't. She left you 10% because it's yours," Clara said. "You built it as much as she did, all of you." He was quiet for a long moment. The wind came off the mountains the way it always did in the late morning, clean and cold, and carrying the smell of pine and high country grass, and the cattle in the near pasture were moving in their slow, deliberate way toward the midday water. And the whole enormous, ordinary machinery of the ranch was turning as it always turned, indifferent to legal documents, in human decisions, in the quiet revolution that had just occurred in a lawyer's office in Sheridan. "Your grandmother would like who you've become," Boone said. Clara looked at the boots on her feet, the dark leather soft with years of use, shaped by a woman she had never met, and now wore every day as naturally as if they had always been hers. "I think I know her now," she said. "Not who she was, who she is, in the desk and the land and the way all four of you talk about work and in the way this house was built." She paused. "She's in everything here. She's in me somehow, even though we never met. That used to feel like a loss. Now it feels like something else." "Like what?" Boone asked. "Like a conversation," Clara said. "A long one that started before I arrived and won't end when I leave a room." The others had come to stand near them, not crowding, just present. The way they were present at the end of a long day on the ranch, close enough to be part of the same thing, comfortable enough in each other's proximity not to require explanation for it. Slade said, looking at the house rather than at anyone in particular, "She fired me twice in the first 2 years. Both times I deserved it. Both times she hired me back." He paused. "She never mentioned it after. Just handed me the schedule for the following week, and that was the whole of it." He stopped. "Then I've been trying to deserve the rehire ever since." Nobody laughed because it wasn't a joke. But something in the air shifted slightly, the quality of shared recognition moving through the five of them. Beckett said, "She told me once that the test of a person wasn't in the good years. It was in the years where everything went wrong and they showed up anyway." He looked at Clara. "You showed up." "I signed a legal document," Clara said. "You drove 4 days from Boston with 3 suitcases and no boots," he said. "Then you stayed. Those are different things from signing a document, and you know it." Rafe said quietly, "The mayor's name is going to have to be settled. She was unnamed when she came. We were waiting to see what suited her." He looked at Clara. "It should be your call." Clara thought about the bay mare with the white blaze and the watchful, intelligent eyes, and the morning she had walked to the center of the round pen and put her nose against Clara's shoulder and simply breathed there. The long process of earning completed, the decision made without announcement. "Grace," Clara said. Rafe nodded once, the way he nodded when something was exactly right and required nothing added to it. They went inside. Beckett cooked because Beckett always cooked, because feeding people was the form his care took, and he had long since stopped finding any reason to be self-conscious about it. He made the kind of meal that takes time and attention, the cast iron, the good stock from the cold room, the cornbread from scratch that had become over the course of the 90 days one of Clara's specific pleasures in a life that was accumulating specific pleasures at a rate that still sometimes surprised her. They ate at the barnwood table, all five of them, in the early afternoon light that came through the west windows, and the conversation moved the way it had learned to move over 60 days of shared meals, easily without agenda, the way water moves over familiar terrain. After the meal, Clara went to the office and sat at her grandmother's desk for what she recognized as she sat down would be a different kind of sitting than all the sittings before. Not the sitting of a visitor, not the sitting of an heir serving out a contract, the sitting of a person who lives here at the desk that belongs to her in the house that is hers, with the work of the place spread before her in the familiar handwriting of a woman she now knew well enough to understand. She opened a new page in her notebook, not the original notebook from Boston, which was full, but the second one she had bought in Sheridan in week 5, the one without color-coded tabs. She wrote at the top of the page, Year 1, what needs to happen. She wrote for 2 hours, the operational improvements she'd identified over 60 days of close observation, Beckett's efficiency plan, which he'd walked her through in detail over the last 2 weeks, the grass-fed marketing strategies she'd been researching on the evenings when the ledgers were put away, the horse breeding program that Rafe had laid out for her in careful, patient detail on a series of afternoon rides through the eastern pastures, his voice quiet and specific the way it always was when he was talking about something he had thought about for a long time. She wrote about what the ranch could become without losing what it was. She wrote until the light changed. Boone knocked on the doorframe at dusk the way he always did, announcing himself respecting the threshold. "We're inside," he said. "Fire's going." She put the pen down and followed him to the main room where the fire had been built up against the evening cold, and the room held the warmth the way it always did, the log walls doing the work they had been built to do. Slade had taken the chair near the window. Rafe sat on the floor with his back against the couch, which was a thing she had noticed he did often in the evenings, the posture of a man comfortable enough in a space to choose the ground over the furniture. Beckett had settled at the near end of the couch with a mug of something that smelled like coffee and cinnamon. Clara sat in Ruth's chair by the fire. Boone sat in the chair beside hers. For a while, nobody spoke, which was its own kind of language between people who have earned the right to share silence. The fire worked steadily at the wood. The mountains outside were going dark. The cattle in the pasture would be settling for the night, and the horses in the barn, and everything that belonged to this place would spend the hours of dark doing what it did. Resting, waiting, persisting, and in the morning, it would all begin again. "I found a letter in the journal," Clara said. The room was quiet. At the very end, after the last dated entry, she wrote it separately, just a few lines. She could see them from memory now, clear and exact, the way Ruth Whitmore's words always were. She wrote, "The bravest thing a person can do is choose a life that requires them to become more than they currently are. Most people choose smaller. I hope you choose larger. I believe you will, or I would not have arranged all of this. With love from the woman whose boots fit you, Ruth." The fire made its sounds. The room held everything in it without spilling any of it. Slade said from his chair by the window, "She was right about you." Clara looked at him. His face in the firelight was quieter than she had ever seen it, the sharp edges softened by warmth and the particular loosening that comes when a thing you have been holding in tension for a long time is finally allowed to rest. "I don't know that yet," she said. "I've been here 61 days. "I know it," he said. "That's enough." Beckett said, "For what it's worth, I'm expanding the cornbread recipe. We're going to need more." It was such a perfectly Beckett thing to say that Clara laughed fully genuinely, the kind of laughter that surprises you with how complete it is, and the sound of it filled the room and went to every corner of it, and something that had been held tight in her chest since Boston, since childhood, since longer than she had words for, went with it. Rafe almost smiled. Slade looked at the fire with the expression that meant he was pleased and had no intention of saying so. Boone looked at her. The firelight was between them, and the room was warm, and outside the Montana dark was full and absolute, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her. She understood now, since the morning she straightened out of her car in the gravel drive and into air so clean it made her dizzy. You never told me, she said quietly enough that it was between the two of them, what she meant. When she said you'd know me when you saw me. He was quiet for a moment. The fire shifted, sending a brief brightness across his face. She said you'd come in with a plan, he said, and the plan would fall apart on the first day, and you'd stay anyway. He looked at her directly the way he always looked at things he considered important, without deflection, without the protective distance that most people maintain. She said that was the only thing worth knowing about a person. Clara held his gaze. Was she right about you? The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest thing she had seen from him. She was right about everything. He reached out, then a thing she had not expected, and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His hand was warm and calloused and certain, and it held hers the way the house held warmth, completely without effort, as if it had been built for exactly this. Across the room, Beckett was looking at his mug with an expression of profound satisfaction. Slade had gone back to watching the fire. Rafe had his eyes closed, and his face had the open, unguarded quality it only showed when he had decided a situation required nothing more from him than to simply be present in it. The fire burned down slowly the way good fires do. Nobody moved to add wood because nobody wanted to be the one to break the particular quality of that hour. Eventually the coals went to orange, and the room cooled slightly toward the comfortable, and the five of them sat in the warmth of something that had no name in any of the documents that had brought them here, but was in every way that mattered the most real thing in the room. 3 years later, Clara Whitmore stood at the window of the ranch office on an October evening, watching the sun go down over the Beartooth Range for the 1132nd time. She knew the number because she had counted them not from compulsion, but from a decision she had made in year one that some things deserved to be counted. The particular way that light left these mountains, the long gold withdrawal from the ridgelines, the valley going to deep blue before the peaks finally let go of the last brightness, was a thing she had decided 61 days into her first year was worth keeping track of. The ranch was different now in the ways she had planned for and the ways she hadn't. Beckett's efficiency plan had worked as he had said it would, with the precision and quiet confidence of a man who had been waiting 3 years for someone to hand him the permission to implement it. The margins had widened, not to comfortable, not to easy, but to sustainable in a way that the old ledgers had only occasionally achieved. The grass-fed marketing program had opened accounts with restaurants in 3 states, the kind of places that cared about where their beef came from and were willing to pay a price that reflected the answer. The horse breeding program, Rafe's patient construction of what had always been a secondary possibility into a functioning secondary income, was in its 2nd year of profit. The numbers in the current ledgers were better than any Ruth Whitmore had recorded in her last decade. Clara kept the old ledgers in the desk alongside the new ones. She wanted the context. She wanted to know what the place had cost before she knew what it was worth. Whitmore Creek Ranch had been the subject of 2 pieces in agricultural journals that year. One had asked Clara to contribute a section on generational land transfer in modern sustainable operations, which she had written at Ruth's desk on a series of February evenings when the snow was heavy on the mountains and the house was warm and the work of the following day was already laid out waiting for morning. She had found in writing it that 7 years in the library had not been wasted time. She simply understood now what she had been preparing for. The 4 men had stayed. This had never been in doubt, not after the signing, not after the addendum, not for a single day of the 3 years. They were co-owners now in law and in practice, each with a stake, and each bringing to that stake the specific knowledge and commitment that no contract could have prescribed, because it came from who they were and not from what they had been offered. Slade ran the cattle operation with a precision that had become recognized in the county and then beyond it. He had hired 2 young hands in the 2nd year and was teaching them the way he had been taught by doing the thing and expecting them to keep up and pay attention without softening what needed to be learned. Clara watched him with them sometimes and thought about what Slade had been at 17, arriving here with nothing but a bad attitude and the capacity for loyalty that most people never develop at all. He still drove the fence line alone on Sunday evenings. He had never stopped. Rafe's horse program had grown beyond what the original plan had imagined. Buyers came from Wyoming and Utah, and occasionally from further drawn, by the reputation of horses that had been handled with patience and intelligence from the start. Grace, the bay mare with the white blaze, who had put her nose against Clara's shoulder on day 61, and breathed there was the foundation mare of the breeding program, settled and wise now, at 5 years old, with the particular authority of an animal that has been trusted and has learned to trust in return. Beckett managed the books and the marketing and the supply chains and cooked dinner most evenings, and the cooking had become over 3 years, something that people drove distances to be invited to. He had stopped taking online business courses because he was now teaching one remotely to a university extension program that had approached him after reading a profile of the ranch's operational turnaround in one of the agricultural journals. He had accepted with his usual ease, as if the recognition were simply the natural outcome of work done well, and he had never doubted it would arrive. Boone ran the whole of it with the same authority and seriousness and absolute daily commitment he had always brought, and the difference now was that he brought it to something that was also his. Not just in law through the 10% Ruth had left him, in every other way that matters more. Clara put the pen down and looked out the office window at the last of the evening. The mountains were doing what they did, holding the light past all reasonable expectation, the peaks still gold against the darkening sky, while the valley below had already gone to shadow. She had learned to love this particular moment, the way the land held light in reserve, releasing it slowly, as if it understood that endings deserve a certain duration. She heard boots in the hallway. Boone's walk had a particular quality she could identify now from the other end of the house, the measured deliberateness of a man who moves through spaces as if they are worth respecting. He appeared in the doorway and looked at her at the window, the way he had been looking at her for 3 years with the specific attention of a man who does not take for granted the things that matter most to him. "We're losing the light," he said. "I know, Bob." She didn't move from the window yet. "I was counting." 11:32, he said. She turned to look at him. He was leaning in the door frame, arms crossed, and there was a quiet satisfaction in his face that had not been there in the early weeks when she had first arrived, something settled and at ease that came from years of choosing the same thing daily until the choice was no longer separate from the life itself. "You've been counting too," she said, "since the first year." He came into the room the way he always entered spaces, with the deliberateness her grandmother had built the thresholds to require. "I wanted to know if it was worth keeping track of." "And every one of them," he said. She crossed the office and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders the way he did now, without thinking about it, the gesture as natural and unself-conscious as the morning work, as the evening fire, as the particular way he had of looking at the mountains that told her without words what this land meant to the man who had spent his entire life standing on it. She was right about everything, Clara said. It was what she had told him the night she signed the papers, and she said it now the way she said it, sometimes when the truth of it rose up with particular clarity, not as a statement requiring response, but as a thing worth saying aloud, the way you speak the names of things you don't want to take for granted. "She was right about you," he said. "That's the part that mattered." Through the door she had left open, she could hear Slade say something to Beckett in the kitchen. Something short and dry, because Slade was always short and always dry, and Beckett's laugh following it, and Rafe's quieter voice adding something that made both of them go quiet in the way of men who have been told something precise and true. The mountains held the last of their light. The valley below was still, and the cattle in the pasture were settling, and the horses in the barn were quiet, and Grace stood in the near corral with her head up and her white blaze visible in the fading light like a clean mark on the evening. On the gatepost at the entrance to the property, Ruth Whitmore's original sign still hung, the wood weathered to silver, the carved letters still clear, Whitmore Creek Ranch, established 1983. Below it, added in the first year, a second board hung on iron hooks. Slade had carved it on a February evening when the weather had kept them all inside and the fire had burned long into the night, and the 5 of them had sat together in the main room with the particular ease of people who have stopped imagining lives elsewhere. The letters were deep and clean, and those who chose to stay. Clara had read those words every time she came and went through the gate, which was to say she had read them 10 or 15 times a day for 3 years, which was to say they had become part of the landscape of her life, the way the mountains were part of it, present without being noticed until the moment they were noticed, and then impossible to imagine being without. She looked out the office window at the last light on the Beartooth Range. She had driven 4 days from Boston with $400 in a notebook full of color-coded plans and canvas shoes and absolutely no idea what she was walking into. She had arrived expecting a groom and found a contract. She had arrived expecting 60 days and stayed for the rest of her life. She had arrived a librarian with a gift for organizing other people's stories and discovered in the place where all her plans came apart the only story she had ever been entirely and exactly herself inside of. She had inherited a ranch. She had inherited a desk and a pair of boots and a green journal and a key and 4 men who had been waiting, though none of them would have used that word for someone who could make the place become what it had always had the capacity to be. She had inherited a family, which was the thing Ruth Whitmore had known all along, and had arranged with the specific care of someone who understood that the most important things cannot be given directly. They have to be found. They have to be chosen. They have to be built day by day in the weather and the work and the long accumulation of ordinary mornings that become over time an extraordinary to life. The light left the mountains. The stars came out over the Beartooth Range in their numbers, as they did every clear night, as they had done every clear night for longer than any record Ruth Whitmore or Clara Whitmore or anyone else had ever kept. Boone's arm was around her shoulders. The fire was going in the next room. The ranch was quiet and alive and entirely, completely hers. Clara looked at the dark where the mountains had been and felt as she felt every evening at this hour the particular satisfaction of a person who has found the place where their life makes sense and has had the courage to stay in it. It was not the life she had planned. It was better than anything she could have planned, which was the thing about the lives that are actually meant for you. You cannot see their shape from the outside. You can only find them by walking into them by staying. When staying is hard, by learning to read what the land and the work and the people around you are saying until their language becomes your own. Ruth Whitmore had known this. She had built a house with thresholds that meant something and left a key sewn into a saddle and written a journal in a green cloth cover and designed a contract with old language that meant something different than it appeared to mean, and she had done all of it for a granddaughter she had never met, but had watched from a distance long enough to believe that the watching was worth doing. She had been right about everything. Clara Whitmore stood at the window of the house her grandmother had built and looked at the Montana night, and she was home.